So last week we discussed how the Empire could have changed their strategy to potentially achieve a victory at the Battle of Endor, and I referenced the fairly large Imperial naval presence present during that battle, but I figured today we could sort of dive into what that naval presence looked like and talk about the fleets and some of the ships involved in the Battle of Endor on the Imperial side. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. Today we're going to be focusing on Imperial fleets at the Battle of Endor, one of the most consequential battles of the Galactic Civil War, and arguably the most consequential large naval battle of the Galactic Civil War. It ultimately saw Imperial forces defeated by the Rebel fleet, the destruction of the second Death Star, the death of the Emperor and Darth Vader, and the beginning of the collapse of the Empire. It's considered by many to be the battle in which the Empire really sealed its fate, and while they wouldn't formally cease to exist until the Battle of Jakku a year later, it was the beginning of the end. And the Empire did bring some of their best forces to the Battle of Endor, so let's talk about those forces. So let's just add a little bit more background here. So during the battle, the Rebel fleet arrived to a seemingly undefended Death Star, only to have a large Imperial fleet appear out of hyperspace behind them, pinning them in between this Imperial fleet and the Death Star. That was the plan thought up by Imperial leadership to keep Rebel forces from escaping so the Death Star could basically take pot shots at the Rebel fleet. So, with that setup, let's start by talking about the first Imperial naval element present at the battle, and that's the Death Star itself. The second Death Star, larger and more capable than the first, was obviously a monolith on the battlefield. It was massive, and really doesn't need a lot of description or introduction. It was constructed following the Battle of Yavin as a replacement for the first Death Star that was destroyed at that battle, with a plan to improve on the design to eliminate the flaws that resulted in the destruction of the first. It served kind of as a flagship for Palpatine during the engagement, albeit I think calling it a flagship is a bit of a stretch. Even, I would say, calling it a naval vessel is a bit of a stretch, but it's definitely worth mentioning here. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's talk about the actual warships. So, the flagship of the Imperial fleet itself was the Executor, an Executor-class Super Star Destroyer that served as the flagship of Death Squadron, Darth Vader's personal flight of Star Destroyers. Death Squadron is, by the way, the same fleet that was responsible for chasing the Rebels during the events of The Empire Strikes Back. They transported Blizzard Squadron to the Battle of Hoth. They blockaded Hoth and later Cloud City, so they've been a pretty big part of the Imperial pursuit of Rebel forces for quite some time. So the Executor served as the flagship, and we see the Executor filling that role throughout the duration of the battle, whether it's being used as a command ship when Imperial forces are being held back, or leading an Imperial charge into the Rebel forces as the showdown intensified. It was ultimately the destruction of the Executor that led to the beginning of the collapse of Imperial naval ranks during the space battle. During the battle, the Executor's bridge was destroyed and it was sent careening into the Death Star. Before the battle, and even during the battle, the Executor continued to serve as the flagship of Death Squadron, which was there in its entirety. Death Squadron includes many of the Star Destroyers that we know and love from throughout the Star Wars series, including, by the way, the Devastator, which is Darth Vader's personal flagship before the Executor was finished. It's the first Star Destroyer we see in A New Hope. Among that is quite a few other Star Destroyers, mainly ships that were sort of named in the books that came out with the movies. Some notable ones are the Avenger, which was responsible for chasing the Millennium Falcon through the asteroid field, the Conquest, the Stalker, the Tyrant, and the Ultimatum. Attached with this flight of Star Destroyers, by the way, would be a large complement of TIE Fighters, which had been upgraded since the last time we saw them. During the events of The Empire Strikes Back, they would have been predominantly TIE LNs, the standard TIE Fighters, but by this point they've been primarily upgraded to the TIE Interceptor model. That being said, Death Squadron isn't the only Imperial naval force present at this battle. Death Squadron is a massive fleet, but the Empire really wanted to hedge their bets, so they brought in a sector fleet as well. The Model Sector Fleet is the sector fleet for the section of the galaxy that Endor was in, and it too was called up and placed in this larger Imperial sort of task force that was dispatched to be engaged at the Battle of Endor. Now, it's worth mentioning that the Model fleet is far smaller and less consequential than Death Squadron. They had a handful of Star Destroyers to contribute to this battle, yes, and it's likely that the Tectors we saw, I believe, would have been from this formation. one interesting thing about the Model fleet is we know at the time of the Battle of Endor, they operated Venator-class Star Destroyers on small patrol missions, so it's technically possible that there were some Venators present at the Battle of Endor, although we never see them on screen and they're never mentioned anywhere, so it's a stretch, but it's technically possible. They brought their own complement of fighters and support craft to this engagement. There's one other fighter element I want to bring in, and it's the starfighters garrisoned on the unfinished second Death Star, which still clearly had a fairly large fighter complement, which definitely took part in this engagement. So you had fighters from the two fleets, plus the two fleets themselves, and then the fighters from the Death Star and the super laser from the Death Star, all participating in the space battle of Endor against a single, large, but relatively small rebel fleet. But as I mentioned, most of these Star Destroyers are part of Death Squadron, which was the sort of personal fleet put together under Darth Vader to hunt down the Rebel Alliance. If you'd like to learn more about the ships of Death Squadron and the history of that element, I'll leave a link up here to a video I made a while back on Death Squadron, its history, and the ships that made up that fleet. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think bringing in a sector fleet was really necessary. Death Squadron is a very capable naval force, and they still would have likely outnumbered the rebel ships present at that battle, so do you think it was really necessary to bring in a sector fleet, or do you think Death Squadron, had they been managed properly, could have handled the situation on their own? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars, or anywhere else in science fiction, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.